Hey there, folks. This video is a follow-up on the previous video in this page that goes into detail about the syllabus. And what I wanted to do was spend a little bit of time offering up some thoughts and suggestions that get a little deeper into the content of those latter slides about, thinking about what the structure of a course might look like depending on the level. Because especially if you are someone who didn't do an undergraduate degree in English or creative writing, um, you might not have much at all experience with trying to think through, oh my goodness, what would an entire course look like? And in your syllabus assignment, I'm going to be asking you to try to essentially plot out a full version of a class that you would love to teach. So you can look for more information on that assignment there. But I wanted to go a little deeper into some of the things that you might be thinking about as it relates to both this particular assignment where you're taking your model ideal class and building it in your practice syllabus, but also when you go out to try to get a job teaching, it will be helpful to be able to talk through how you might differentiate one level of class versus another. So we are going to talk about that first, because course level really does matter quite a bit when you're thinking about what are you going to teach. And this may feel extremely obvious. Duh, you're going to do something different in a class that is an introduction to creative writing course versus a class that is a graduate level seminar on something in creative writing. So just some things to think about here. So and some of this is going to be a little bit repeat, just a little bit deeper, more reflection on some of the things that I said in a previous video. But so an introductory and lower level course. So, maybe an introduction to fiction writing or, craft of poetry at the 200 or sophomore level is going to need to utilize what I call more structured days. So when you take a look at the sample syllabi in this module, you're probably going to see some different levels of detail in terms of specificity of what's happening on a given day in a given class. But especially in those lower level courses, there's going to be more days that involve a certain amount of lecturing, probably more model text reading throughout, perhaps using what I would call like a creative writing textbook, something about the craft of writing, and more overt structuring as it relates to particular craft techniques, and less focus on student workshopping, though you might see in some of our examples that that can often still be present. And when I talk about overt structuring related to particular craft techniques, is what I mean is, a syllabus schedule is probably gonna a little bit more overtly dictate what subject as it relates to writing is going to be discussed on a given day. So, for example, let's talk just a little bit about your general introduction to creative writing course. I have structured these and seen them structured, generally speaking, in two different ways. And those are what I'm going to call craft versus genre. So, the first of these, the version that is focused on craft, separates the course content typically into different kinds of technique or elements or strategies or tools of writing. So at my previous job, when I taught introduction to creative writing, I spent 2 weeks talking about the concept of image, 2 weeks talking about the concept of voice, 2 weeks on character, 2 weeks on setting, 2 weeks on story. These are kind of the elements of craft as Janet Burroway defines them in her book, Imaginative Writing, The Elements of Craft, one of the sort of many introductory level creative writing textbooks that people will choose. And so I opted to use that organization. So in those 2 weeks on image, we were reading poems and short stories and nonfiction. Students were choosing which of those things to write when I gave them prompts, but it was because we were focusing on a craft structure more so than a genre structure. And when we talk about genre structure, that's where we might spend 2 or 3 weeks focused on fiction and what it means to write fiction, 2 or 3 weeks on poetry and what it means to write poetry, 2 or 3 weeks on nonfiction, what it means to write nonfiction, 2 or 3 weeks on drama, et cetera, et cetera. And I put et cetera in here because people conceptualize what we mean by craft and what we mean by genre in many different ways, right? So there's no one right way to organize a class like this. But these are generally the two different ways of organizing. I have also seen, and I have done this a couple of times where it's a combination of the two. So the last time I taught this course, I spent 2 weeks on each of these things. And then for the last part of the class, spent a week focusing specifically on each of these. So we talked about fiction across all of our weeks on these craft techniques, but then we spent 1 week specifically writing and thinking about the concerns particular to fiction, 1 week particularly to concerns of poetry, et cetera, et cetera. One of the great challenges of an intro class is there's so much that you want to get through that it can be really hard to get through everything. You'll see this perhaps in some of our sample syllabi. But it can often be a combination of the two. There's no right or wrong way to do this. Rarely does this include full class workshops. You will see some time given to workshopping, but more focused on smaller group workshopping, because a lot of times students are not quite ready at the intro course level, their very first creative writing class, to review everyone's work in the class, or to have their work reviewed by every single person in the class, because that can be very daunting if you've never taken or done any writing before. So those are just some things to think about in terms of the structure of an intro course. When you're talking about genre or subject-specific courses, intro to fiction writing or advanced poetry writing, at the undergraduate level, these are almost always driven by model texts and craft concerns. So you'll see, for example, in my sample syllabus from my former fiction writing course, usually the course is driven by a pair of collections of short stories that students are reading, and we spend our time talking through all of the different things that you are thinking about when you are writing fiction. There is often an emphasis on low-stake writing exercises, in-class activities, et cetera, et cetera. We've talked about workshops to a certain extent already, but usually there's 1 or 2 rounds of student workshops done class-wide. So this is where you move maybe from small groups of workshops to a whole class workshop. And then there's also usually some incorporation of time and discussion of revision strategies. So once students are now building and writing full-blown drafts of things, how do we help teach them and think about revising? Okay, so you'll usually incorporate some time on that. And these classes often have just as much variety, if not more, than in an intro class, in that an intro to creative writing class has these staples that they want to explore, but writers and teachers will use lots of different ways to explore them. In these genre and subject specific courses, because there are so many things you could be teaching and studying, there are endless ways to go about teaching these classes. But you might see some patterns emerge in the sample syllabi that you'll take a look at. So then your third, and I'm breaking these into kind of 3 piles to make this digestible, is your advanced and graduate level courses. So one big thing here is that there is a much greater expectation that students are writing on their own. So when I used to teach my undergraduate intro to fiction writing course, students would have these devoted exercises. They'd write a couple of pages to start a couple different story ideas. Then they would pick one and expand it into a 5 or 6 page draft that I would review with them. Then they would get that to a 3,000 word version that they would get workshopped by the class. So you kind of are giving them these guideposts and these check-ins at that intermediate or introductory level. As you get to the advanced and graduate level, you really, and you've all probably experienced this in some of your classes, by week 2 or 3, it's expected that you've produced a story or a packet of poems or an essay or a 1-act play, that you're not getting these check-ins with your instructor to produce. It's just by this week you have a story ready to go. So there is that greater expectation that students are writing on their own without needing those guideposts and those landing moments. There is more time for more reading. The upper level courses and graduate courses expect more to be done by students as homework or outside of class, so you can ask them to read more, both model texts and their peers' work. So that applies to both of them. And so to that end, especially if you're in a traditional 16-week in-person setting, there's usually room at least for 2 rounds of workshopping, if not 3. Obviously, our program is a little different. In our 8-week courses, many of you probably have mostly gotten workshopped once. Sometimes, depending on the class, your instructor has managed to squeeze in 2. That's because we're working in an 8-week system. If you were in a 16-week class, you would certainly have time to do 2, if not 3 rounds of workshopping, especially dependent a little bit on the course. So you have a lot more room to structure things to have more of that in those graduate level courses. Okay. So then in the last thing I just want to mention is, and you don't necessarily need to have all of this spelled out in your syllabus. Again, you're going to look and see in our examples a variety of ways that people have chosen to particularize and be detailed in their schedule of activities. But variety is always a good thing. So obviously we've talked about workshops. Discussions often go along with reading model text. If you assign something to be read by students by a certain day, you obviously are going to carve out time in that class session to discuss those in some way, whether that's small group discussion, large group discussion, questions you provide, an open-ended conversation. Writing exercises, again, both things that you have students complete at home, things that you might do in class. If you ever took creative writing classes in undergraduate, I remember there was in almost every class that I took, there was like a warm-up 5-minute writing activity on most class days, those sorts of things. You might have students give presentations on something. I have found that to be sometimes very effective and sometimes not effective at all. Obviously, there is a component of you as the instructor lecturing. I should have put that in quotation marks because really, when I think about a creative writing class, it is more conversational, right? You might have some slides on something, but you might also just go in and start talking about something. You might write stuff on the board. In an online class, you're probably going to have more of these kinds of things where you have videos of presentations. That would be kind of a lecture, right? And then conferences, right? One-on-one conferences with students, either during class time or outside of class time. If you're in a traditional setting, it is not unusual to carve out some time to have conferences with students, and you'll see some examples of that in your sample syllabi. So as you're thinking about the syllabus that you're building, you don't necessarily need to, for the schedule that you come up with, explain the lectures that might happen on a given day. You might just have the topic. If there's a writing exercise that students are going to complete at home and turn in as an assignment, you would maybe indicate when they're going to do that, but you don't necessarily need to put in your daily, schedule of events that students are going to do a particular in-class writing exercise. You certainly want to indicate when they're workshopping. You want to indicate if there are reading assignments, what those reading assignments are and when they're due. But you have a lot of variation and a lot of leeway as you're thinking about what goes into that actual daily calendar. When we move into our last couple of weeks and you are sharing with us some lesson plans, that's where you will break down, how something is happening, what someone is doing for what amount of time in a class session. So you're going to come up with a week's worth of class material, which could be for an online class or an in-person class, traditional 15, 16 week or an 8-week. That's where you'll break down, this would last 20 minutes of our 75 minutes. You don't need to break that down in your syllabus. Okay, so these are just some things that you can think about. I would now invite you to go take a look at all of those sample syllabi, see what you observe, post those observations in our discussion board, and then get started thinking about your own mock syllabus.